Alright guys, welcome to another video. In this video we're going to cover divs, and we're going to cover it in ways you have never seen before. Now, in most cases you need to group things. In life you have to group things. You have a box where you group your shoes, the shoes you wear to church, the shoes that are slippers. In your house you have a store where you keep food. In your room you have a wardrobe where you keep your clothes. In the toilet, you have things that are grouped in there. You have the toilet, you have the sinker. In the kitchen, you have different utensils that you use separately. In life, you always have to group things. And so that is basically how the web works. For every web page you see, there are different groupings. You can have a grouping for the nav bar on top. You can have a grouping for the hero section. You can have a grouping for the main body, and then you can have a grouping for the footer. Every time you're trying to group something, you're discussing a div. What are divs? A div is a container that you use to group things. Let's get into it. Let's start an HTML document and then get a div. The proper usage of a div. So you write a div. So this is a div, and a div is a box, like we said. And with every box, you have the opportunity to create things. In CSS, let's call up the div. So we'll go to div. Don't forget, when you are selecting elements in CSS, just call their names. But when you're selecting them as a class, you have to use a dot in front. For the div, we want a background of red. In other words, the color of the div. So we'll say red. Very common color. Because it's a box, it needs a width and a height. So width and a height. Width of 300 pixels, a height of 300 pixels. Don't forget your syntaxes. If you need me to cover syntaxes in HTML and CSS, leave a comment in the section below and I will explain to you. So now we've set a width of 300 pixels, we've set a height of 300 pixels. There's one thing we have to do in order for us to be able to see this styling. We have to go back to our index.html. Don't ever forget this. And then in the header section, don't forget this is the head, this is the body, this is the end of the header section. We have to put our styles.css. So you say link, but what are we linking? We're linking our styles.css sheet. Very important. So in that href section there, you say styles.css. Now, once you do that, all the content of the styles.css will then show on your HTML. So if we go back to this web page, we'll see a red box. We don't want red, we want blue. So if we come back to our web page, we'll see a blue box. There is something I need to explain to you, which is the first thing you have to understand about a div, is that it's a block level element. A block level element is an element that runs across like this. What does that mean? Well, if I come back to my HTML and I duplicate this block, so I have three divs. Div 1 ends here, div 2 ends here, div 3 ends here. All the divs will stack themselves on top of each other. The reason you don't see the spaces in between these divs is because each div doesn't have a space between them. So it's taken as a one single block. So put a space in between each div so that you can see it better. I'm going to go to styles.css and I'm going to set a property for that div and say margin bottom, and I'm going to say 30 pixels so that you can see it very well. So now each div has a margin of 30 pixels. This is the 30 pixels. So now you can see clearly we have three divs. The question is, why did the div stack vertically? Well, the reason the div stacked vertically is because a div is a block level element, which means that all of this place is used up, you just don't see it. You have to keep this in mind, or else as a beginner you're going to struggle with understanding how to control the behavior of divs. Let me show you this website we're building. You see, these boxes here were divs. So there's a div, there's a div, there's another div, there's another div. Now, if the situation of the div is in such a way that it has to stack vertically, how then do you achieve this? Well, you have to make the div relinquish this desire to be a block element. And one way you do that is by controlling the behavior of that div. The way you control the flex and tell it, oh, you are no longer what you say you are, is to do something about how it sees itself. And how does it see itself? It sees itself currently as a display block. That is, it's a block level element. Now you need to tell it, well, dude, you're no longer a block, you are now an inline block. Once you tell it like this, if you come back here, it changes its position because it now sees itself as an inline block. But a div by default is a block level element. Let me show you what I mean. So if I change this now to a block, you go to the default position without, this is just that you are writing its default position to it. If you remove this now and go back to the page, it will still remain stacked horizontally because that is the default position. What do I mean by default? So every car comes with a default. Every phone comes with a default background, comes with a default color, default font until you change them. So the way CSS was pre-configured is to stack a div as a block level element. Keep that in mind or you're never going to get anywhere with a div, right? So that's first number one. A div is a block level element. Let's now go back to the other one where I said, well, a div is something you use to group elements together. Let's say you want to group a text, you want to group a number, you want all the items in that div to behave in a certain type of way. Now, let's go back to HTML and then delete all these divs, right? And keep the first div in the picture. So now let's say I want to use this div now to group a couple of headers, right? Or maybe I want to write a couple of things, a paragraph, whatever it is, an H1 all the way to H6 or whatever it is. Whatever I write in this div, all the properties of that div will be affecting the behavior of the content within that div. Let's say I pick H1 and I press enter. In this H1, I want to write hello world, right? Hello world, right? And I want a ton of them because I want you to see that it's something you use to group things. So in some cases, people can call it a container. This is why they call it a container. So now, if we come back here, we're going to see a lot of hello worlds in a box, right? Now, but look at the way the behavior of the hello worlds are. The hello worlds are stacking vertically. Again, that tells you that an H1 is also a block level element. Keep that in mind. So, but because we're looking at divs, we're not going to look at H1s and its unique properties, right? So now you see all the hello worlds are stacked vertically. Now let's say, well, I want to control the behavior of the H1s. I don't want the H1s to stack vertically. I want a lot of them, but I don't want them to stack vertically. I want them to stack horizontally. What you do is that you then talk to the container, which is Mr. Div, and say, well, I want all the elements inside of you to stack horizontally, and I don't want them to stack vertically. How you make that control is to say, well, display flex. Now, if you come back here, all the H1 elements now stack horizontally. Well, again, let's do something about that because we want to see spaces beside every single H1. So now, instead of putting a margin in front of every single hello world, we can just come to the div and say, well, inside this box, everything inside this box, I want you to put a gap of 30 pixels in between each and every one of them. And so if you go back now, all the H1s now have a gap in between them. Now, this is so unique because if you have to put the same styling on 7 H1s, what if you have 1,000 H1s that you have to case into a box? That's going to take you forever to be able to get that done. So what you do is just tell the container, okay, well, tell everybody inside of you to behave like this. It's just like when you talk to the governor of a state, well, pass this policy that everybody in your state can get blessed, or maybe there's a palliative or something that you just have to give to everybody. You just tell the leader, just do like this with everybody. That's basically how a div works. It helps you to arrange the content inside of it in a certain type of way that makes them happy. Now, let's say I want to do some styling to the H1s, right? And so that you can see, well, let's say I want to put a background, in front of the H1. And don't forget that every element in CSS is pre-configured in such a way that you can apply the same styling across, but you can add a height and a width. So let's just say we had the height to this dude. So let's say we have a background to this, but we're not doing anything about the height. Let's say we have a background of blue, so we're just going to say red for the H1s, right? And if you go back now, you'll see a red background. Now, because the height is, because again, it's designed in such a way that it's supposed to morph with its container, we might have to set the height property for the H1. So we can just say height. Let's just say height of say 20 pixels. So that way it'll stop acting angry and then constrain itself. Now 20 pixels is too short, so we could say maybe 100 pixels. So that way at least we know we covered up. Now the problem here now is that the div is smaller than the content of the div. So how do we fix that? Well, we'll go back to the div. We can say now that the width is 1,000 pixels, right? And then make it just as wide enough so that it can take the size of the div. Now, I want you to notice something very important with the behavior of this div. Let's say I call the div now 2,000 pixels. Well, the div is now wider, right, than the box. But there's nothing we can do that stops this div from going outside, from going inside, because this guy will always start as a block level element. It'll stick to the edge of the frame. So the way you fix that, well, is to tell the Mr. Div again, well, put a padding, right, to this and say padding of 30 pixels. Now, the div has now added a padding to itself in such a way that at the start of the block, you find that, right? So now, so you see a space in between. You don't have to put a padding in your elements. You put a padding in the div so that the content of the div can center into itself. So, let's reduce this back to 1,000 pixels right now, right? And then go back here, and then you see that it's now shorter, and then it's now added that padding on this side and added that padding to this side. Now, one last thing I'm going to show you about a div is, okay, well, why is this thing centering on top like this? I want all the content of the div to be centered into the box, right? So what you do is, lastly, you come back here and then say, well, align items center. Come here and say justify items center, and then lastly you say justify content again center. So if you go back to the div, all the content is now centered into the page. Well, let's make it look pretty and then reduce the height of the div to about 150 pixels. Now you have all the items centered into the page. So I want you to realize that the first thing is that a div is a block level element. You can control that by making it an inline block element. And then a div is a container. And whatever you do to the container applies to everything in that container. So that's all about divs that I want to tell you now. In the next video, I'm going to tell you something more about divs and how you can control the properties of the div and how you can make stylings for one div and all of that. Now, if this has helped you, I want you to hit the subscribe button, hit the like button, turn on the notification bell, and then go into the comment section and tell me if this has helped you and what more videos you need. These videos are basically targeted at beginners who are working with HTML and CSS. And I just want you to see the joy and the fun of really understanding what you're doing so that you are not groping in the dark. Until I see you in the next video, I'll be looking in the comment section to see what you want me to talk about next, and then I will definitely talk about them. Until then, peace, bye bye, happy coding, have a lovely day. Take care.